Hello and welcome to another edition of the Waypoint podcast, where we give you Torah insights from the weekly Parsha. This week is a fascinating one. It's a beautiful one. There's actually a lot here in this one, but it's actually very simple. So starting in chapter 19, you get interesting in a lot of your Christian Bibles. It may actually title this chapter Moral and Ceremonial Laws, because again, in Christianity, they acknowledge a distinction between those two sets. But this is actually just the complete holiness code, right? Yeah, that's what most of this Parsha is going to consist of, is the holiness code. So in chapter 19, you get a lot of the positives, a lot of the things that you are to do to be holy. As a matter of fact, it even opens up with Hashem saying to say to the children of Israel, "Be holy, for I am holy," right? And then going into chapter 20, we get a little bit more of the don'ts, the things to abstain from so as to not defile yourself and be unholy. Not committing harlotry with Molech is one that comes to mind here. Another one being not to consult mediums, and just a number of other things that are unholy. There's really no better word for it. And it finishes again, right? It bookends all of this with another statement here in chapter 20, verse 26, to be holy, for I am holy. One of the fascinating things here is almost right in the middle between those two. In chapter 20, verse 7, is again a be holy, for I am holy, right? So 3 times in this Parsha, we read that statement. And it's clearly not a distinction of moral and ceremonial law here, but this is all one holiness code. And that is something that my compatriot Seamus has a wonderful lesson on. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and pass it over to him for this beautiful lesson that he has for us.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Waypoint. Of course, Parashat Kedoshim. Brad just gave you all the wave tops, so without further ado, let's just jump into it. This is a fairly short Torah portion, and likewise, my lesson will actually be fairly short. But not all the great lessons have to be long necessarily. I hope. So I actually wanted to focus on not just really the title of this Torah portion, Kedoshim, holy. And the fact that it's repeated 3 times throughout this entire Torah portion particularly, but the tense in which it is written, the entire first opening words is written in the future tense. And that is, you'll see it reflected that way in your English translations. You'll see it as, you shall be holy, for I, Hashem, your God, am holy. And then it kind of moves on, and there's sort of this list. And that list, by the way, it sort of seems arbitrary, and in some sense, that would not be an incorrect way of describing it, but I can guarantee you the list is far from arbitrary. So, focusing on that first set of words, you shall be holy, I was reading through some commentary brought to you by the Or HaChaim. Highly recommend his commentary, by the way. And on that opening verse, he says something that I find to be pretty important as we move forward for what I have prepared for you today. We can further explain that the verse means to say as follows. The words, you shall be holy, may be interpreted not only as a command, but also as a statement in the future tense, meaning this mitzvah, this commandment, never ceases. Since for every gate of holiness into which one enters, one is still capable of entering into another gate beyond that. For there is no limit to the levels of holiness that are available for anyone who wishes to obtain that stature. You may learn from this the various levels of holiness attained by the prophets, one higher than the next, with Moses rising above them all in holiness. And perhaps there can be a level of holiness even greater than that of Moshe, namely the level of our King, our Mashiach, who will be crowned with the highest of spiritual crowns, as can be inferred from the verse in Isaiah 11:2, and a spirit of Hashem upon him, etc. And according to our sages of blessed memory in the Zohar, who say that Moshe of the past will also be the future Redeemer, as we have elaborated in the explanation of these words elsewhere, and that's from way back in Genesis. He talks a little bit about the first shall be like the last, or rather the last shall be like the first. And so, Moses, the final Redeemer, Mashiach, will be a prophet like unto Moses. So there's commentary on that, and that's what he's making reference to, but I will move on. It emerges that there is no limit or boundary to the level of holiness that one can attain. Therefore, Hashem said, "You shall be holy," in the future tense, to indicate that this mitzvah never ceases and that this mitzvah to be holy always applies. Hashem then gave a reason for his words, "For holy am I, Hashem, your God." For there is no limit to the holiness of Hashem, blessed be he. And Hashem wants his beloved sons to be similar to their creator in their ability to attain extraordinary levels of holiness. Accordingly, you may assess in your own mind that levels of holiness you can attain. Okay, a little bit of a whole lot there, but what I kind of want to focus on is there's a few things that commentary is just beautiful all the way through and through. I absolutely love what the Or HaChaim has to offer in his commentary on the Chumash. But something that I want to point out is that essentially this is being in the future tense. It's also in the imperative, which means it's written like a commandment. Right? Imperative is like a command. Shema, the word Shema, is in the imperative. So yes, it means to listen as in like listening, but it more means to listen like you better listen to me, like obedience, obey, listen to me when I'm talking to you kind of. It's imperative. It's this idea that it's written like a commandment. So it's to be understood like a commandment. You are to be holy. What this sort of means, at least the way that I see it, especially as we go through the list of what is the holiness code in this particular couple of chapters in this portion, is that it's not simply enough to avoid doing what you're not supposed to do. That you're called to be holy, right? So the difference is unholy. That's the other side. Now, unholy doesn't always mean sinful. And in fact, I would make that's a very clear distinction that we see. Unholiness does not equal sinfulness. Sometimes it just means common. It just means something that isn't holy. There's nothing sinful about a spoon. A spoon is just common. It's just not holy. It's not different. It's not anything, special or new. But if you have a silver spoon that your grandmother gave you, who, maybe came from another culture or time, that spoon has special significance, which makes it holy in a very traditional sense of the word. It's set apart. It's different. It's special in some way. It's not like the other spoons. And so as the people of God, we're called to be not just common. It's not enough to just not do what you're supposed to avoid doing, right? And be like the common masses and just kind of just sit comfortably as a common person. In fact, I could say that 3 times here, Hashem calls you out to come out of this complacency of being common, to actively seek being holy. That's why it's written in the imperative and in the future tense, not to just live holy because you don't murder, you don't steal, you don't lie, you don't do these things. That still puts you in the realm of holy in a way that, that might be a little bit different from the rest of the world, but that's not seeking out the positive commandments. That's not actively doing the things that are also going to be found in this list. There are things that you should avoid, obviously, absolutely. And then there are things that are in here that should be sought out. And it's you should be actively doing these things to be holy, to set yourself apart from the rest of the world as God's holy people. And it's imperative. It's imperative that we do that. It's repeated 3 times that we do that in just this Torah portion alone, much less the rest of the entire Torah. And Of course, depending on how you read this list, there's a bunch of stuff in here about idolatry, which is going to be very relevant to the children of Israel, particularly as they are coming out of idolatry and going into a world of idolatry. We don't necessarily have that problem today in our current Western world. I'm speaking from an American perspective, by the way. But yeah, it's not just being and avoiding is enough. To seek out the opportunity to do a mitzvah, any positive mitzvah. You're not necessarily obligated to perform any positive mitzvah necessarily, but to seek it out and do it anyway. And a current example like that could be of the commandment of the tzitzit. You don't have to wear tzitzit unless you're wearing a four-cornered garment, but you should seek out an opportunity in which you would be able to fulfill a commandment like that. I'm currently not wearing tzitzit as I say this, so it's really funny. So do as I say, not as I do. I'm just kidding. My tzitzit are currently right behind me on my four-cornered garment, but it's this idea that you can seek out the opportunity and put yourself in a position to fulfill commandments on purpose, because that's what it means to be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy, and to separate yourself in that way, in a very active sense and not in a passive way. This is not a passive commandment that you're holy because you just happen to not be doing certain things. It's very passive holiness. This is active holiness. And you're called to be actively holy. And that's why the commandment is the way that it is. And the Or HaChaim, it's not just something that we came up here with out of the blue. The Or HaChaim also goes on to talk a little bit about this and in other areas of the Chumash, especially in this Torah portion. And so not only are we supposed to seek out in an active sense of being holy because the way that the commandment is written, the Or HaChaim will also go on to point out that the commandment is written in such a way that it's also a promise. You shall be holy. And at the end of the day, when you've been a member of the covenant, you are a citizen of the coming kingdom. The way this commandment can also be read is that when the kingdom finally comes, the end of day comes, you shall be holy. It's written like a promise. You will be my holy ones. I will pull you out of the world, and you will be part of the kingdom of heaven on earth, and you will be holy in that way. So it's not just a present tense duty that we have to fulfill as a sort of sense of duty, but also a future promise that we have as a hope to look forward to. And may the Mashiach return speedily in our days so that we can experience that. Thank you once again for joining us this week, and I will see you next time. Shalom.
Welcome back. And again, Seamus knocks it out of the park. What a spectacular lesson. Interestingly enough, this actually does pertain to a little bit of the Shabbat discussion that I was having with my father. For me, this would be yesterday, because the path of all men it's really just one path. It's two ways, right? There's the correct way and the incorrect way. And this week's Torah portion really bears that out, in that really there are also two ways here. There's the imperative and the passive. There's the what you should do, and then there's what you shouldn't do. And the interesting thing that I found in this week's Haftarah for this week's Haftarah connection is the order reversal that we see. So in the Parsha, we see Hashem give the imperative first, right? He tells us a lot of what we should do. And then in chapter 20, we get a lot more of what we shouldn't do to maintain holiness. Now, in his recounting to the children of Israel through the prophet Ezekiel of these wanderings in the desert, this order switches. So it begins with him instructing Ezekiel to recount the actions of the Israelites, and specifies that he bid them to abstain from idolatry, to get rid of their idols so that they could follow him. And in verse 8, we read, But they rebelled against me and would not consent to hearken to me. They did not cast away every man the despicable idols from before their eyes. Neither did they forsake their idols of Egypt. And I said, to pour out my wrath over them, to give my anger full reign over them in the midst of the land of Egypt. Now, this then continues, but instead, what we read starting in verse 11 is that Hashem gives them his statutes and his ordinances, and he gave them his Sabbaths, right? All of the Moedim, the holy days. And then in verse 13, he says, but the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They walked not in my statutes. They despised my ordinances, which if a man keep, he will live through them. And my Sabbaths they desecrated exceedingly. So where this is different again is that it begins by telling us what he told them not to do, right? He told them to abstain from idolatry, or it actually does phrase it in an imperative, to get rid of their idols. But then after the idolatry part, we read again that he gave them the imperatives, right? He gave them his ordinances, his statutes, his Sabbaths, right? He gave them the things that they should actively be doing rather than the things that they should be abstaining from. So it's a bit of a flip of what we read in this week's Torah portion. But again, the result here is the same, is that they didn't do this, and they didn't take care to do this. And ultimately, that generation dies in the wilderness, and that's where our Haftarah ends, actually, is in verse 18. He says, but I said to their children in the wilderness, in the statutes of your fathers do not walk, and do not observe their ordinances, and do not defile yourselves with their idols. I am the Lord your God. Walk in my statutes and keep my ordinances and fulfill them, and my Sabbath and keep my Sabbaths holy, so that they will be a sign between me and you, so that you may know that I am the Lord your God. In not so many words, be holy, for I am holy. We read that same theme, not in the exact words, but the theme is inherently present in this week's Haftarah. So I think that's something really to ponder on, because it I would say seems to simplify the daily choices we have. You know, at any given point, you are presented with a choice, and there is a right way and a wrong way. And sometimes it's hard to see something as that, right? It's hard to see it as that binary. But really, ultimately, the life we live is, in fact, that binary. It is, there's right, there's wrong, and we should abstain from the wrong and actively pursue to do what is right. That being said, that is the Haftarah connection for this week. It was pretty easy this week, actually, for me to tie it to this week's Parsha. If this has blessed you, certainly hit the like button and subscribe, and definitely ring that bell. We put out more and more content every week. Definitely have some special things coming in the future. So stay tuned and keep a watchful eye. Shalom.